Being president of SJTA is a full-time release position, so I spend almost all of my day actually in the office that I am in now. But I do still teach a zero-period calculus class at Pioneer, and have for at least the last 3 years that I've been president. And whether or not I get to continue to do that next year, I think will depend a great deal on what school looks like next year.
Yeah, that's been a huge concern, right?
What I would say a source of anxiety more than, I definitely there are more questions than answers, I think, among all parties.
Yes, I agree. Well, and hopefully we'll have answers. I'm looking towards July 1st, and I know that the county is putting out their guidelines that day, and the district said that they would have some plans starting on that day. Do you think that I'm concerned that everything's rolling out at once, right?
I share the same concern, and I honestly don't know that it's realistic that it will all roll out at once. At least if it all rolls out at once publicly, the only way I think that's possible is if the county office of education has given some sort of advance notice to the district of what some of their guidelines are going to be, perhaps in draft form. They actually did that with the document that they released in early June.
Right.
And that's because that there are a variety of constraints that the district is not in control over. Some of those are from the state. The state budget apparently has an agreement, so that will go to the legislature for approval later this week. But importantly, they're also expected to pass what's called the budget trailer bill that will possibly, I would say likely, contain some regulatory relief for schools in this circumstance. One important thing is how do schools calculate attendance moving forward in a situation where what the information we've gotten is that parents will have parents will have the flexibility of keeping their children at home, so that the provision of state law that says school is compulsory will be waived for a year. Parents will be able to keep their children home. But if children are staying home, that isn't actually, we would normally have to count them absent. And there are consequences for being absent. And when students are absent, school districts don't get money. So there will probably have to be some kind of legislative language that will describe how we're supposed to calculate attendance for students whose parents choose to keep them home. That's just one example of some of the laws that the legislature is either going to have to write a temporarily rewrite or waive or give authority to some other government agency to work around. So we'll expect to get a lot of clarity from that probably later this week in the budget trailer bill. And then the second thing is the health order is going to describe a lot of the work that we do right now. Schools would fall under the child care provision of the health order, which means that we wouldn't be legally allowed to have classes larger than 12. I have been told in a variety of, a couple of formal meetings and some back channel conversations that the health department is unlikely to extend to keep that rule in place for K-12 schools for next school year. Okay. 12 will not be the number. They apparently are still debating if there will be a number, or if it will be based on square footage, or if it will be based on distance between students, or if it will be based on some other factor. So that those details, which we'll have no control over. The rule will be what the rule is from the county. Right. Those details we'll need to have before we can formally deploy a model, because honestly, having a class size of 12 versus having a class size of 15 versus having a traditional class size of 30, it makes a lot of different things possible.
Do you think that we'll have something to work with in time for teachers to prepare well?
In my ideal, we would have had something in January, right? And then we could have planned for it. So no, we certainly will not have enough time. We're well past the point of having enough time. But I know that everybody is working as hard as they can. They're adapting to, I think, the information that they have on the ground. And they've said they're going to get it to us as quickly as possible. We'll turn it around as quickly as possible. Next year, I think will still be, unfortunately, a little chaotic. My great hope is that it will be significantly less chaotic than the last, 3 months of last school year.
Right. Right. Well, and I know that there's been, parents have brought to the district, and the district has been looking at some software to help organize and coordinate that better, like Canvas or another group that works well with the Infinite Campus.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that.
I've been sitting on the district's the reopening task force, and there are with the parent representatives and the employee representatives and management, and definitely that has been a topic we've discussed, and that is, in reviewing the survey data, it was very apparent. But I think the single most common complaint related to that kind of technology was there are too many different platforms. That parents were supporting, who had multiple children, were supporting different platforms, occasionally in the same school or across the district. So creating some sort of consistency, both in terms of actual user interface and how teachers use it. And then there was also a lot of suggestions to look at other programs. I have done some online Zoom demos with Canvas and Blackboard. They're probably the two largest market share. There's called a learning management system. They're the two largest in the United States. I have one coming up later this week with Infinite Campus is our existing gradebook program. They have a very new learning management system that's only maybe 18 months, 2 years old. So that's another one that I think it behooves us to look at, since we already have a portion of their software in place. So when you log in online to see your students' grades, you're logging through the parent portal of Infinite Campus.
Okay.
So there is apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but a learning management system component of that piece of software that we don't own today. And then I think Moodle is very popular outside of North America. I think Canvas, Blackboard, and Moodle are the three largest full learning management systems. And then the district has Google Classroom, which is I think in a different category. It's sometimes called an LMS Lite.
Yes.
And so there's probably a conversation to be had about whether or not we just create a more consistent use or an implementation of Google Classroom instead of getting a new platform, because any new platform is going to require a training component, not only for teachers but also for students and parents. And so we do need to take a look at the entire system and look at how many different things are potentially new, and how many we could reasonably train for and deploy in August. So I think an LMS for me is pretty high on the list to create consistency. I would actually probably prioritize a different video conference software ahead of an LMS, but WebEx is not my friend.
Is Zoom any better?
I think Zoom is a lot better.
Okay.
And WebEx apparently has a lot of the features of Zoom. I just don't know how to use them or.
I have a question about the task force. I know that the district has chosen the different advisory groups to bring in parents from. One parent asked, are they making sure that they're covering all the ages of students in that advisory group? Did you get a sense of that?
Yes. I couldn't quote for you exactly which of the parent members have what students, but when we all did introductions at the first large group meeting, Superintendent Alberon, indicated that they'd chosen the parents by looking at the elected officers of the 6 district standing committees, and they had among the officers. Then they didn't necessarily choose the president in every case. They chose a combination of people, so that they had both south, middle, and north geographies of the district represented, and elementary, middle, and high represented. So they built
great.
sort of a combination. And then a couple of they've got a couple of students whose parents are English language learners. A parent who's a student is a special education student. So they tried to make certain that they had different program representations as well.
I'm glad to hear that. If we could backtrack to the spring, there was a broad range of teaching in the spring, and it wasn't limited to this district. I hear it at the state level too. What do you wish the general public understood about the transition to remote teaching for the teachers?
You know, another teacher who was on the task force just said this in the meeting that I left to come join here, because they were meeting a little bit earlier today, and she said that when we left school on March 13th, she said, she was an elementary school teacher. She said, you know, we had actually, the students had already gone home when the word came down, because it was a conference day, so it was early dismissal, and so we left, and then by Monday we had word that then the schools were going to be closed. I think at that point it was 3 weeks. By Monday the announcement was 3 weeks. I think it was on Friday it was 2 weeks, and then Monday it had become 3 weeks. And she said, you know, teachers had never been trained how to do this distance learning thing. Students had never been trained how to do distance learning. Some teachers use things like Google Classrooms and Google Docs, but never in a what we call an asynchronous way, where the teacher and the student aren't directly in connection with each other. And administrators had never been trained, parents had never been trained. All of a sudden we were in this entirely different universe, in which most of our training was no longer relevant, because of the way that we would be interacting with students, and many of the district's sort of you know, central instructional programs. I think our primary elementary school classrooms focus a lot on building early literacy, and the early literacy program requires small group work among students, supposed to working with each other without the aid of a teacher, and then in working small groups with the teacher. And we didn't have any way of simulating that in a distance learning situation. So there's an entire literacy curriculum that it ceased to be available to teachers. And you also recall that they went home, they brought whatever they could with them on Friday, but the technology they have at home, you know, their access to their instructional materials are different. So it was I don't know about if I have a good analogy, but it was like we woke up the next morning and we were suddenly living underwater, and we had to figure out how to do everything all over again.
I'm picturing you with your oxygen tank on for that.
Yeah. Like, whoa, wait a minute.
How much autonomy do teachers normally have with their lessons, and did that change with the pivot to remote learning?
It varies a lot by grade level. I think my elementary colleagues would say they have less autonomy than my secondary colleagues. Okay. Some of the district curriculum I mentioned, the early literacy program, and which includes a guided reading component. There's teacher autonomy to design the activities, and in case make specific selections of what the students will be reading, but it's from a menu that the district provides, and the structure is highly structured. And so there's not supposed to be a lot of deviation. This is a program the district has rolled out over the last 5 years. It started at 4 elementary schools, and this last year is the first year that it's been implemented at all 28 elementary schools in grades K1, and I believe everybody's doing it in second grade this year. Okay. So that's an example of a place where there's relatively little autonomy. In English, language arts, and math classes in secondary school, at least through the Algebra 2 level, there is probably less autonomy than in some of the other areas, because the district curriculum, so kind of the textbook teaching resources the district has adopted, which is called the Pace Setter program by the College Board, really requires actually a particular like an instructional, and it's more than a textbook. Like it requires like a pedagogical choices to make use of it well. Students have to work collaboratively. Almost I've heard teachers say, like, I can't set up my classroom. My classroom has to be set up in pods in a certain way in order to facilitate the teaching of this curriculum. So there is less autonomy in that because of the curriculum that the district has adopted there. In elective classes, on the other end of the spectrum, I would say there's incredible autonomy. There are courses still that do not have specific grade level standards approach to them. I would think, like vocal music, for example. There are some general, musical standards for high school students, but there is tremendous amount of freedom to choose, genres and styles and teaching techniques. So that's kind of like the other end of the continuum. I would say that as you get up into from elementary to middle to high, you see the autonomy increase, and I think that's. I could say more, but I feel like you've got a lot of questions. So
I do. How many teachers are comfortable with returning to full-time classes this fall?
So SJTA just did a survey of its members, and I would say that comfortable. I think the question we asked was how many of you are what is your level of concern about returning next year? I think only like 5 or 10% people chose the not at all concerned. And then there was a pretty good spread among the 4 other categories that we listed. Like a little concerned. And I actually forget what they were titled, but we had a 5-point, call a Likert scale, and one of them was not, but only about 10% that said they were not concerned, and there are quite a few that said they're very concerned. The people I hear most often from fall into 2 categories. One, they're teachers who have pre-existing health conditions that they believe make them more likely for severe illness should they contract COVID. And they have a lot of anxiety about being in a situation where not knowing what kind of social distancing, what kind of personal protective equipment they'll be provided, the students will be required to use. So that's definitely the group of people I hear from most frequently. And I would say we would probably have somewhere between 120 to 180 people who are maybe in the most severe category of that. Adjacent to them, but not, I would say, a wholly separate category, are people who maybe have who live with someone who is in a high risk category, or who are the primary caregiver of someone in a high risk category. And so those teachers are also very concerned about what school will look like in the fall. I have heard from people in that group who are contemplating, they're going to wait and see what the plan is, but they may make a decision to retire. Or take an unpaid leave of absence for some period of time if they feel like they won't be safe returning. Some of them are fortunate enough to be in a situation where they can do that financially. Others I'm more concerned about because they have to work, and it's difficult to ask them to make choices that would potentially have severe consequences to their health. The other group of teachers that I hear about with the most anxiety are teachers who have school-age children of their own.
Okay.
Certainly if you've read the news or followed this at all, you probably, and if you're plugged in enough to be on this call, you've probably done a little bit of research on your own about what schools around the state are talking about doing. And as these teachers see other plans, they begin to envision teaching in them, and they're like, oh, well, if that were my life, like, who would be taking care of my 3rd grader when my 3rd grader wasn't at school? And so there's a lot of childcare questions, which I know that many of you probably or other parent community members have as well. But that's the second group of people I hear from most frequently in terms of anxiety.
Okay. That's a concern to hear those numbers. But I respect that. I mean, I think everyone has these concerns, teachers or not. How soon will teachers, we kind of talked a little bit about how soon teachers will need to plan. You said January, but push comes to shove as we're ticking down closer to mid-August when classes are to begin. If we are in full-time remote, how much time do you think the teachers will need to prepare and have the professional development that they can roll out a better program than we had in the spring?
A better program than we had in the spring. I think we're pretty well assured of that, because we will have had opportunity to actually prepare to launch a program. Like we'll be able to have a lot more systems in place, and we'll be able to have clear expectations from the very first day. I think that would by itself make certain that we would be moving forward. In terms of how much time do they need, I think like I said before, more than we're going to have. Like the moving, I think about, I've talked to some college professors about how they've moved into an online distance learning situation. When their universities, began making that transition, and they said, well, it really took me kind of 2 years before I felt like I had really fully moved and gotten good at this distance learning, or at least as I felt as successful as I was in person. I was like, well, 2 years, we don't have 2 years. But those are they're definitely slower, more methodical transitions, and probably had less resources devoted to them. Like, this is everybody's top priority. So I don't know how much time we would need. It would definitely be more than we're going to have. So we're going to have to do the best job with what we have.
Okay. There are no good answers, are there?
No.
So there have been a lot of cooks in the kitchen, creating the reopening guidelines and setting the expectations. What guidelines show understanding of public schools and current teachers, and what guidelines are a little disconnected, and why?
There have definitely been a lot of guidelines.
Yes. Too many.
So I would say that until very recently, we haven't seen a lot of guidelines that have been created with actually paying much attention at all to, I think the authors would have said, like, we don't care at all about having an understanding of schools and teachers. They were being driven by public health needs. So when the public health department writes the guidelines, I don't think they're spending a lot of time, at least initially, I don't think they were spending a lot of time thinking about the nature of the work that they were changing. They were saying, we have to be this far apart. You have to wear this kind of mask. You have to, because that is what the medicine demands. Right. I think that it's only been in the last maybe 2 or 3 weeks that we've started to see guidelines that are defined to that are created to provide specifically, I think, for individual industries. I think probably the first one that came out was related to construction. I think there was a long war between the conversation with the county, the public health department, and the building trades council, and several developers in the county to devise a set of guidelines that would maintain the public health requirements, but would allow construction to move forward. So I think I've seen that in slowly as the relaxation orders have come out, we begin to see that more and more. I think that's I'm not privy to what's going on in public health, but I think that's what's happening now. I think that public health and the County Office of Education are collaborating to try to marry together, the educational necessity and the public health necessity with the order that would ideally govern us next fall. But how well they do will depend upon. I'll have to wait until I see the order before I can tell you that.
Okay. Thank you. Parents and students are struggling with the insecurity of the unknown classroom models at this time. How is the stress translating among teachers, and what additional supports are being asked to support the teachers?
I think I've talked a lot about the anxiety already, so rather than repeat myself, I would also say that that your average teacher wants to be an A student, right? Your average teacher wants to be successful at what they do. I don't think any teacher does something because they think it will not be quality. And so being thrust in a situation where they are not, by their own admission, they're not doing their best work because of the limitations of the technology and the obstacles and the fact that some of their students don't have access to their classroom. They took that very hard. There was definitely a lot of I would say grief in a professional sense about not being as good at their job as they want to be. I think everybody felt that sort of anxiety of failure in the spring, and that's a difficult thing in our profession. one of my goals is that teachers will feel successful
Mhm.
in the fall, and I think that's done in three ways. One, they're better prepared, and two, they're better equipped, and three, I think that people will have created reasonable expectations, and I would say that belongs both for their supervisors and for the parents in their class, right? That from the very beginning we should have some expectations of this is what's reasonable and this is what's possible given the constraints we're under, and so that's what we need to do.
So with the expectations, though, some of the other districts, their teachers associations went forward with and trying to get an MOU going right away, and we've seen that unravel. But when do you see the teachers association coming to the table and kind of coming to that agreement of what these expectations will be?
I think the commitment that we made with the district and all of the other bargaining unit groups, both there are two classified unions and the school psychologist and the building trades, is that we would participate with the community in this process of determining what the model would look like.
Okay.
And then we would codify what needed to be codified to in relation to our contract and really in relation to working conditions that isn't already governed by our contract, which has some built-in flexibility in it already. So and then to the extent that there might be some new working condition issues, such as the types of personal protective equipment that people could have and things like that.
Okay. Were there with the digital access and having the right technology at home, was the district able to support teachers that didn't have technology at home or didn't have access to the internet?
What's that?
So I
didn't hear your question. There was a garble.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So I was asking that if with the remote teaching, was the district able to help support some teachers who didn't have technology at home and didn't have the right access to the internet?
Were there teachers that didn't have access to the internet? Yes.
Yes.
One thing. So some people you can imagine live up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. They don't have access to high speed internet. One thing that never occurred to me that I learned is that many of my some of my millennial and Generation Z teachers don't have Wi-Fi or internet access at home. They basically their internet access at home is their smartphone. Yeah. So they check email. They can do apps if they really need to. They can use it as a wireless hotspot. But a wireless running a wireless hotspot for like a video conference call becomes hard, and in many cases they've got restricted data plans. So we definitely had teachers who were struggling with the technology. Internet access is expensive. Yeah. We were fortunate, though, I think, when some of the cable providers, Comcast, I think, opened up their wireless access points for free. There was another provider, I think, that did it for free for teachers. You had to register to get access to it.
Oh,
and they so they were able to they were able to get access because in many cases they live in communities where their neighbors have cable, right? So in order for you to have access to the free Comcast touch points, you have to live close enough to someone who has Comcast. We saw definitely among our student population that there were many students who couldn't avail themselves of those because their neighbors don't have Comcast either. So there were definitely some deserts. Some of our members lived in places like that, but the biggest handicap were people who lived sort of beyond the reach of broadband and then who didn't have it because they had a smartphone.
Okay, but the message was getting to the teachers that they could always come to the home office maybe then and use.
Eventually, the communication came out that if you need you need access to the internet, you can come to district office, follow the procedures. I know I think there are probably about 10 to 12 teachers on a daily basis that were doing that from what I understand. Not the same people every day, and that is potentially more complicated though if you have children, or depending on your living situation, like it can be a struggle. But yes, once that opened up, I think we saw far more consistent communication from most teachers to their classes.
Communication at the beginning of this was sparse and difficult for families. How was it working for teachers?
I would agree. I think communication has been a definitely an area for growth for San Jose Unified for a long time. They move so very slowly, and I think are very concerned about putting out precise information in multiple languages that won't be misunderstood. If you notice, I think they definitely have a bias toward providing single page documents, and I think that's in some senses their goal is laudable. They want to their goal is to make communication. I've heard them articulate this. So we want to communicate. We don't want to bombard parents. We want when we send out a communication, we want it to parents to like read it all. So we want to make sure that it's important. We want to make sure that it's clear. We want to make sure that it's 100% accurate. We fact checked everything in it. That we're not going to have to send out a correction later. All of the above. We are interested in. We're interested in. So I just said that all of those things are laudable, but I think there are some issues where perhaps we need to provide more communication. And it might be, and I think in this case there would have been a great amount of grace among parents and the community at large to get information, and then to the district a day or two later say, we're so sorry, what we said yesterday about this, we've gotten an update, and then that's no longer going to be the case. That's really against sort of the DNA, I guess, of San Jose Unified is they're always worried about we don't want to have to correct the information we put out. And here we had a situation where information was changing so quickly that was an almost impossible expectation for yourself to be able to put communication out that's going to be completely accurate. So I think they needed to do a little more. They probably needed to send out a few more first drafts. I also envision, I don't know this for a fact, but I also envision they would write a first draft and it would be going through, 5 or 6 people would be reading it and, tweaking it, and then, getting ready to send it to translation. And then they would send it to translation to translate into Spanish. And then all of a sudden they'd learn that, oh no, something the third paragraph is wrong now. So we'd start back over from the beginning. And I just imagine this sort of, treadmill of trying to constantly update the communication. So I know I was frustrated. Staff members were definitely frustrated. I've heard from many parents who were frustrated about that. I know that nobody was everybody was trying to do what they thought was the best thing. Yeah. But I think that I would definitely advise them to do it differently in the future.
Well, I think what pained me just the public visibility when you shut off communication from teachers and from school sites to parents. And after a few weeks, it's like, do you not trust my teachers to communicate with me? I mean, that's how I felt.
I think that should have been handled differently. I know that what they communicated to staff was that they wanted a single point of communication for all information. What they didn't want was 1,500 teachers, each sort of telling a slightly different version, like the world's worst telephone game, right? A slightly different version of something to families, and then 30,000 San Jose Unified families all making decisions and operating off of slightly different information. Their initial goal was, don't talk to anybody. like everybody should go to the single one font of truth, that special link on the website, to get the most updated edition. I don't know that that rationale was clearly articulated, and I think we could even debate the rationale, but it definitely seemed to a lot of people like it was like, I don't know, we're pulling on the cloak of invisibility or something,
Right.
and we're turning off the lights, and I think that was definitely a mistake.
Well, hopefully we're learning from this experience, right? The district offered mental health for students and staff during closure. Is the culture in the district open for teachers to accept these offers, or is there a need for social climate on mental health to change?
Um, there's definitely an openness, although this is something we struggled with in the teaching profession for a long time. You know,
Mhm.
one of my responsibilities in this role is to sit on the Health and Welfare Benefits Board, which oversees the health plans in San Jose Unified. And so when we get reports from our providers every year about, you know, what are the leading diagnoses, and what's driving costs. And a little bit unusually for an employer with our for an employer with our sort of demographic mix of staff, is that mental health related conditions are the single largest sort of diagnostic category that we see members seeking treatment for. And so they're a large, we definitely, so mental health issues are overrepresented, and this is mostly anxiety, depression, right? Those are, I don't want people to think that there are, you know, people who are not mentally fit to be in the classroom. Like these are predominantly anxiety, depression related illnesses.
Thank
um and so these folks, uh, so we're overrepresented the population, but it is not overrepresented among education employers in California or the country. You know, it's usually the leading cause, the leading diagnostic category for employer health plans in the education, at least the K-12 education sector. So in that regard, I think there is definitely a lot of work we need to do in improving mental health support to staff members.
you.
You know, the benefits package is quite good. I could make some specific criticisms, particularly of the Kaiser delivery model, but um, um, it's a much bigger problem that wasn't going to be solved by you know, some offers of some counseling in this crisis. The crisis just exacerbated the rather significant underlying problem. So you know, as a union, one of our you know, first initiatives after the first week is we asked all of our site reps to make not physical, but to make vocal contact with every single teacher in the district.
Mhm.
Principals got the same directive, you know, just to make certain that you know, checked in with them and just have a friendly conversation. Like, this is not a what are you doing? This is, are you okay? Is your family okay? Like, what are you worried about? And then try to help them to solve what they're worried about to the extent that it's within our locus of control.
You're on Pioneer campus, right? Has having the wellness center there helped staff?
I can say anecdotally that it has.
Okay.
I'm being there just 0 period and then leaving to come to this job. I am not tightly integrated. Like most of my connections now are just with my own class of students, and then, you know, some of my faculty colleagues who've been there as long as I have. But definitely I hear from teachers that, and teachers who were skeptical in the beginning. Some teachers were like, oh, is this going to be a place for kids to just get out of class? And how's this going to work? And they have all been converted. They've said this has made a significant difference. And I think a lot of high schools and some middle schools are looking at emulating the model.
Yes. I know we are in Willow Glen for sure. The three reopening options talked about last week were full closure with remote classes, some form of hybrid, or full-time back to school. The Teachers Association agreement, oh, you know what, we already talked about that. This is MOU, I'm sorry. Should have my glasses
That's
on.
okay.
What can the community do to support our teachers who are asked to step up to a job that may continue to be redefined by the public health department?
The first one, which in some ways is the easiest, in some ways is the hardest, is patience. like none of this is going to be what teachers have trained to do, even with additional training that that we're going to deploy presumably before the start of school here.
Mhm.
Things will not run as smoothly. In to some extent, I think that there might be different problems we encounter because at least it happened at the end of last school year. So teachers and students already knew each other, parents already knew teachers. There were already communication systems in place. There were already structures and routines. And there was a lot of credibility on both sides, right? The teachers knew the parent knew the teacher. And here we're going to enter into a situation that will hopefully be less, well, it will be less chaotic,
Mhm.
but will still not be regular school, and it will be with all new people, right? You will potentially have new teachers. One of the parents on the committee was saying that her biggest concern is actually, I think, has three children in the system. She has her youngest is a fifth grader rising to become a sixth grader, and she said that's the student I'm most concerned about because my goodness, that transition is normally so challenging, and I can't imagine what it's going to be like in this when no one can even predict what it looks like. So
Right.
ISO patience, which I know can be hard, and then there will be some elements of what we do next year that are going to be defined central, that'll be defined by the state, by the county health department, and then will be defined centrally by the school district. But there's a lot that's going to be defined at the local level, that I don't know, I'm just looking at the health order that's still in place today. Like if we had to do symptom checking and we had to restrict parent access to the school site, all of those things are going to potentially create new routines and procedures at school sites, that are going to be have to be invented based upon the local geography and the school start times. And so where is drop off going to be? Where are kids going to line up if they have to get the thermometer on their forehead? Like what does that look like? So helping your local schools think through those things, and then when they don't work out quite right at the beginning, gracefully helping them make them better, I would say.
You mean coming back with a solution?
Well, coming back with but nicely coming back with a solution, because
Right.
whoever made the solution, it was their best idea, right?
Right. That's true. That's true. Let's see. Our nation and our state is failing to invest well in education, and we see that with just some of the mandates and the funding that they fail to follow through with. What strategies are the Teachers Association pressing to mitigate the proposed cuts and encourage changes in funding?
So this is like sort of above my pay grade within CTA. This is definitely a statewide union issue. So and I think what I might be inclined to say is rendered moot by what I've heard is the budget agreement that the legislature and the governor reached today. It from all I read was the LA Times story, which had unnamed sources inside legislative offices. They suggested that the districts would mostly be held at 2019-2020 funding levels with no cost of living inflation adjustment. So in one sense, that is a no cut situation. In some senses, it's about a 2.7% cut, because that represents the decrease in expected revenue. And what you have to understand is that school districts are required not only to balance their books in this year, they're also required to present balanced budgets for the 2 future years based upon specific things they know about now: number of students and growth rate and anticipated increase in cost of salaries and pensions and healthcare, and increased cost in the increased revenue from the state. So school districts you'll get reported this is a no cuts budget because we're going to get the same amount of money we got last year. Great. Could have been a lot worse. But school districts had been told 3 years ago that between 2019, 2020 and 2020, 2021, there would be an increase of, it has fluctuated, and the Legislative Analyst's Office recalculates it about every 6 months, and based upon economic projections, and that number has floated in between 2.3 and 2.7% for the last 3 years. Well, that number has now been set to zero. That's kind of the school districts that had built their budgets for the next 3 years, assuming that amount of change. They now have to rebuild their budgets to deal with the less revenue, not only this year, but the projected decline in revenue in the next 2 years. You hear a lot about like this reserve requirement, and
Yeah.
if I'm going too much into detail, let me know. I could talk about school
No,
finance
because
all the time.
I've been curious about the reserve requirement at 3%. I don't understand why it was set at 3%. And I know that we have a healthier reserve, but
Yeah.
does that mean then we can only use down to that 3%?
So the reserve requirement is set by state law, and it's set. It's the percentages by school size. So very, very large districts have smaller reserves.
Okay.
The reserve, I think the maximum number is 5%, and the lowest number is, which only applies to Los Angeles Unified, is 1%. So we fall in the middle, and actually most districts fall in the 3% category. The smaller you are, the bigger the reserve. Because there are probably maybe 20 districts that fall into the 4% category between us and LA. And what the 3% reserve requirement is you have to have a reserve of 3% of operating costs. It's not this year or the next year, but 3 years from now. So this 3-year budget plan that you've projected needs to show that not only will you be taking care of your finances over the course of the 3 years, but at the end of the third year, you'll have a 3% piggy bank on the projected operating revenue that you will have in that third year. Now, there's a saying that we have on school finance, which is that the third year never happens, because as great as the projections are, they'll always wind up being different. But that's, so when the school districts are worried, so we have, I think, don't quote me on this, I think our reserve right now is about 17%. But we have been deficit spending the last 2 years. We were projected to deficit spend for the next couple of years, so that by the end of the third year, the reserve requirement is close to that 3%.
Right.
And it kind of fluctuates a little bit every year. But the district is a little conservative in budgeting, right? They always wind up taking in a little bit more money than they thought. They always wind up, spending a little bit less than they thought. But you never want to get caught in the situation where that reserve requirement's upside down, because then you risk state takeover. Pretty much the only thing that gets a school district taken over from the state is presenting a consecutive unqualified budgets. That's what it's called when you aren't meeting the reserve requirement in the third year, or actually going bankrupt. And in California, you may recall, San Jose Unified was the second bank. It was the second school district in the 20th century to declare bankruptcy. When it declared bankruptcy in the early 1980s, there was a little district in Texas that did it in the 40s. In fact, it wasn't even settled law that school districts could declare bankruptcy. Since our bankruptcy in the early 1980s, the state has now changed the law so that districts don't declare bankruptcy. What happens is they get an emergency loan from this sort of state auditing entity, and then the state takes over the district's finances. So at any given time, there are probably 20 districts around the state that are in state receivership. Oakland famously bounces in and out of it, all the time.
Are there benefits from that, though?
Being taken over by the state? No.
Yeah. Okay. You had to ask.
Well, because what happens is the school board becomes advisory, okay, and the state receiver really becomes a dictator. Like they have unilateral authority to set the district budget, to hire and fire, to do everything. The school board, all the power, the school board's powers are set aside. So if you believe in democratic government, then state receivership is usually a bad thing.
Okay, so it's a little more of a takeover.
Yeah.
Okay. There were a lot of hybrid models on that June 6th county guideline. Did you get a chance to look through them?
I have. Unfortunately, I didn't spend too much time looking at hybrid models, because until you know what the legislative guidelines are, and to a lesser extent the public health guidelines, you don't know what hybrid models are gonna be allowed, either at the state level or at your local level. So they're good food for thought. They're good to kind of think about. But in terms of saying, oh, this would be a great one, I don't want to put my hopes in that wagon, because entirely possible that the constraints we wind up operating under, realistically, probably like 2 weeks from now, may not allow all of those.
Okay. I was just wondering if any of them resonated with you as being realistic for our pocket of the county.
I wish, well,
But but
it
as
will.
you
So
said, it's hard to,
the thing I know the least about is what is the state going to do?
yeah, right. Okay. Are there some solutions that are being generated from teachers right now?
Yes, as I said, we just ran a survey where we asked for some feedback. I probably get unsolicited email, you know, mm, probably 5 to 10 a day from people who have ideas on various things. I've tried to sort of triage the various issues and separate them and say, um, what are because the most important thing is to figure out what school looks like, what we call the model. And then there are lots of cascading questions after that, like how do we, you know once we figured out the model, how do we serve lunch in the model, right, to minimize the number of kids who are, so like I got an email from a teacher today who had a really interesting idea on how to serve lunch, and I'm like, that's great, but that's like, probably 3 steps down.
Mm.
And that's probably going to, I would imagine that might be a more localized decision. Certainly the district has to make sure they can get the food to all the campuses from the central kitchen. Um, but there are a lot of ideas,
I would imagine.
and I'm glad people are being creative, and some of them aren't possible given the constraints that we're under. Um, but there's definitely no shortage of ideas.
What are I'm at the end of my list of questions, but I think one of them that I had for you was what are some of the concerns that you're hearing that you wish the public would understand and know that these are the concerns teachers are having?
Um, I would say that the biggest concern, and all the surveys that San Jose Unified has done and SJT have done have bear this out, is that health and safety is teachers' primary concern. When I think there was an article in the New York Times when near the beginning of this, late March, or probably around early April, where they were looking at jobs and how much at risk people were to become infected, based upon the information that we had at the time. And clearly, like the top categories of at-risk professions were all in the healthcare industry, right? Because the doctors and nurses are coming into contact with sick people,
Mm-hmm.
even with all their PPE, they just have constant interaction with it. And one thing that I noticed, because I always look for teachers when I get some sort of big, like occupational, analysis, I always look for teachers. And what was interesting is they'd entered teachers into this sort of database, and it was a cloud kind of graphic. They entered us twice. The first one they entered us in was teachers during the distance learning, and we were extraordinarily safe. Because of course we're at home, the students are at home, like we're sheltering in place, like we can do our work, to that extent, in that context, and we're very safe. But then when they plotted us at school again, we became the second most dangerous profession after healthcare workers,
Okay.
because. I don't know how they were modeling personal protective equipment and social distancing, but because we come into contact with such a large number of potential disease carriers who are very likely to be asymptomatic, so they may not, when they're sick, no one may realize to keep them at home. And so that is very frightening to a lot of people, that we're going to be at a place where we will be at greater risk than the vast majority of other adults in our community. And at one level, I understand that schools are necessary to allow the rest of people in the economy to get back to work and to help us traverse this. But it's a pretty big set of risks that teachers will be taking on. Like, part of my job is to try to make sure that they can be made as safe as possible, both in terms of how the school day is structured, and in terms of the kinds of protections that we were able to provide for them. So I would ask you to remember that, that, and as we get more into this, and if SJTA starts making demands, or starts starts advocating for certain changes to potentially the district plan. I don't have any anticipation that that's going to be, we're going to need to do that. But if that's the case, it would never be because we do not, care about your children or their learning or that, but it would be because they're very concerned that um, they do not get very sick and potentially die.
Right. Right. Yeah, this is an awful illness that you wouldn't want to wish on anyone as it is. And the beginning of the school years is always when everyone gets something, it seems, and this is one you don't want everyone to be getting. Well, I'm opening it up to if anyone else has questions they wanted to ask. I know we have a few teachers on this, if you wanted to share a little bit of your experience. You can unmute yourself. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if people are having trouble figuring it out, or I don't see anything, any questions in chat. I know that there's been talk about maybe having the district kind of control a minimum of how many teaching minutes. What's realistic about these asks that parents are looking at making?
What do you mean control the minimum amount of teaching minutes?
So, when we had that pivot to remote teaching, it was kind of a do your best because we couldn't control what people had as their resources, right? And some people had no teaching from their teachers, and other teachers heavily loaded the students. So it's just when we have more of a process of how the remote teaching will be done, will there be I guess the question would be then, will there be a reasonable baseline of what that will look like as far as teaching time with the students?
So like the teaching time with students is governed by both Ed Code and the SJTA contract. So there are minimum amounts of student contact that are presented in both of those. I wouldn't anticipate that those would change drastically in some kind of new model. I would expect that there would be, more expectations. We'll have better opportunity to make certain that people have the technology they have in the technology they need in whatever workspace they're using.
Mm-hmm.
I know that some schools are talking that even if students are in a full at home distance learning situation, that teachers may be able to work from their empty classrooms, which I think would potentially work. And indication is that a lot of teachers would like that solution. They feel they have more access to resources. So I think the outstanding questions are going to be in some kind of model where students aren't at school every day. What does their learning look like when they're not at school? And I think what the feedback that from both teachers and parents and students is that the fully, what we call the fully asynchronous model, is maybe not the most effective. And we've similarly heard that there are not we've also heard that there are not forgive me, I lost it. It's the end of a very long day, so I have lost my train of thought.
I appreciate it.
So we have if we have so I don't expect that the minimum number of minutes would change, but we would need to better define exactly what's happening, exactly what's happening when the students aren't at school. We also heard feedback that nobody wants very few people, I would say, want children to sit at home and stare at a computer screen for the 6 or 7 hours that they would normally spend at school. Like, there needs to be some sort of combination, but how exactly that works, I don't know. And what again, there would need to be minimum expectations of so there's consistency across classrooms, across schools around the district, because um, it, it can't be improvisational anymore.
No, no. Uh, I don't think anyone would be happy with that. I don't even think teachers were happy having to come up with something improvisational in the moment. I think that mostly answered this question. This is from Jennifer. She wants to know if you could share the current thinking on what the model will likely be for the fall.
I don't know. We won't have. As I said, we're still waiting really on information from the state. So I think the deputy superintendent shared in the community calls and at the board meeting, last board meeting, that absent some kind of legislative action, school is compulsory. We have to have 180 days after so many minutes, and so that means everybody's back full time in the classroom, no ifs, ands, or buts. I have heard at least 7 different rumors of how the state would potentially create flexibility, and all of them change the models that are potentially available. So so I do not know that until we get information about what the state's putting in the trailer bill, and I think that will provide a lot of clarity, because either the state will answer the questions, or the state will identify someone who has the power to answer the questions. So they may delegate to the state superintendent the power to define what attendance looks like in a distance learning situation. They may so right now the State Board of Education has the authority to grant waivers to all the sections of Ed Code that we're talking about. But the State Board of Education doesn't have the capacity to grant waivers for 1,000 districts in the next 50 days.
Right.
So there was a proposal floated apparently in the budget negotiations that for 1 year, the state board's authority to grant waivers would be devolved to county superintendents of education.
Wow.
So one county superintendent could conceivably, grant waivers to 30 districts in a year, which might be more reasonable. So even if the state did one of those two things, then even though we wouldn't know exactly what the rules were, we could pretty easily pick up the phone and say, okay, here are the 3 things we're talking about. Are any of them non-starters for you? And then they would help us, I would hope, narrow the choice pretty quickly. So I do not think it is going to be possible to kick the can much farther down the road.
No.
I hope.
I think we're all wanting the answers right away in July 1st seems a long ways away.
Tell me about it.
See, Marin is asking the budget constraints that have been mentioned. Is there budget for the implementation or training of learning management system?
So yes, at the cost of what though? So San Jose Unified definitely has money, and it's a matter of repurposing, something else. The district also has reserves. Like I said, right now those reserves are projected to be spent down. They got to keep the money that they have, but they could do that. As I've looked at it, learning management systems are kind of in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay. I would say that if there are technology, significant technology investments, like those could be in the millions of dollars. That's going to be the bigger ticket item. I think the district owns about serviceable about 20,000 portable devices. Those are going to be laptops, iPads, Chromebooks. If we were going to move to something that was more distance learning focused, or perhaps it would behoove us to do it anyway in the event that there is at some point in time next year an unplanned closure, we'd need to be more in a 1-to-1 situation. So we'd need, at minimum another 9,000 to 10,000 portable devices. Likely, we would want to upgrade some of the devices we have. There probably will have been some loss or damage to the devices that we handed out in the spring. So that price tag will probably be in the millions of dollars. I would guess that's probably the biggest budget item. The training piece is another one that there's just probably the biggest constraint there is just the staff time to develop and deploy the training. Sometimes the companies will create trainings, and particularly the ones like a learning management system, their people talk to teachers a lot, so they may be able to come out and provide a lot of support on that. But many times the trainers are not necessarily as familiar with how the things will be used in the education space, and so there's a lot of work that's required in the of the district as well.
Okay. Jody, you had an answer you wanted to share, and I didn't see you post that. Did you want to? I'm not sure if it was this question or an earlier question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it was just earlier talking about what can parents expect as far as balancing out the teachers who gave way too much work and the teachers who gave none at all.
Yeah.
I can speak for myself and many of my colleagues, but certainly not all teachers in the world. We want that. We want that kind of consistency. We want to know that we need to be doing X number of hours. We need to be providing X number of synchronous lessons, X number of asynchronous. And we want accountability for the kids too. And I know that's something I've been hearing up and down from parents. And as a parent of 2 San Jose Unified kids, one from my own school and one at the middle school, my kids would have bought in far more had we been able to keep their assessment of their learning, of their mastery, consistent. But, you know, we had to punt. We had to improvise. And as a drama teacher, I enjoyed the choice of that word. But yeah, we're really hoping that no matter what this looks like, if there's any kind of distance learning whatsoever, that we have things really spelled out for us so that we can share it with the kids, we can share it with the parents, the community, but also just for our own well-being.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think everyone is eager for a plan, and it's unsettling not having anything to really work with at this point. I was distressed to see a post from a teacher saying that they'd given themselves 2 days off and were right back into digitalizing all of their curriculum and getting ready for full-time remote teaching if they have to.
Yeah, I think that was actually me.
Was it you?
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I thought, that is painful. You're not giving yourself a break after this rough spring you've had.
Yeah, you know, I don't make a martyr out of me. I have no life, and this is the way that I spend my time. So.
Well, then some teachers might want to put you to work for them.
This is Renata. Can I share just a little bit about my experience?
Yes.
Would that be okay?
Yes.
So I, along with a couple of our colleagues of at my school site, are teaching extended school year, and it is the expectation is for us to do 1 hour synchronous lessons every day of the week with our group of students in math. And when I first signed up for this, I was like, yes, I'm going to learn so much, and whatever happens in the fall, it will, like, anything that I go through now will really help to prepare me for that. And that has all definitely been true. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that I wasn't prepared for was really understanding and figuring out how unprepared I am to be teaching synchronous learning. Every hour I spend in a lesson, I am spending at least twice as long planning that hour, trying to figure out, not only am I differentiating for students' abilities, I'm also differentiating for their access. So I'm thinking about what kinds of activities can I create for students where the ones who can access my WebEx meeting and annotate the slide and do everything right there, they can do that. While the kids who are calling in on telephones who can't really see what I'm doing can also access. Mm-hmm. And so that, on top of learning all of the technology, like how can I turn my iPhone into a dot camera, and how can I screen share, all of the different things. There has just been, well, and then on top of that, having my colleagues and I, like, we debrief almost every day about what went well, what didn't go well, what are we going to try the next day. So I just wanted to like share that with you all, because I know that a lot of, well, one, teaching is really a highly trained profession. Like, I would know how to do all of that stuff in my classroom because I learned how to do it in teacher training and through experience. All of this stuff now is brand new. And then two, a lot of what we do with our students, there's so much more behind the scenes that we have to do to create that experience with our students. So just something to like think about as we're moving into whatever fall looks like is not only are we thinking about the instructional minutes, the time we're spending with students, the type of lessons we're doing, but also all of the learning that's going to happen for us to be able to implement that, as well as the planning and reflection pieces that are really just as crucial and important.
Well, you brought up a good point that you're having your class prep time is in completely different ratio than it was before, right? When you were normally teaching classes, so now you're like, it's 2 hours to 1 hour. I'm imagining it's more than 2 hours, but okay, I'll work with 2 hours. But what was it before when you had the brick and mortar classroom to work?
Yeah, I think well, what's different is that you have like your teacher's guide, and the first year teaching a curriculum, you're going to take a little bit longer to like figure it out, plan it, make it your own. And then the more you teach, the faster it gets. It gets to, in my opinion, an okay sustainable level. And then you're also, I'm elementary, so I'm teaching like 7-ish different subjects every day. But I turn to the next page in the teaching guide, I read it, and I'm like, okay, I know how to make this come to life. What I have to do now is I have to take that teaching guide and turn it into an entirely different digital lesson, which is like doing it all over for the first time again. So I think like that's one of the biggest differences. Did that answer the question?
It did. It did. Well, I mean, when I took the...
I lost it as I was talking.
It was eye-opening to me to take a professional development classes, and we were just, you know, part of the work there in my group of teachers was to just take one project and plan it out and differentiate it just on the students that were described to us. And I couldn't believe it took us, you know, almost an hour to just do one lesson that would maybe be a half an hour lesson. And I thought, you know, how much prep time are we accounting for? And is it enough for the rigorous education we're asking our teachers to give our students? And if we weren't doing that before COVID, then, you know, we're certainly not going to be able to do it if we have remote learning continuing. Just an observation.
Yes, I agree with that observation.
And Jody, I don't know if you could read the chat, but it was like, yep. And then how many hours after the lesson trying to figure out how we could have done it better. Yeah. Imagine. Is there a good amount of collaborations happening still? Was it possible to collaborate when we were all in the remote with other teachers? I know I was talking to a teacher who lives across the street from me who's not in this district, and she was frustrated that she had other grades were collaborating well and some were not. And is there a look at the collaboration model and helping to roll out lessons for, you know, grade? I mean, this works best for the elementary school years, but and maybe some of the middle school classes.
Yeah, at the high school, I have the joy of being in 2 different departments. I'm in both English and Performing Arts, and the Performing Arts department is me and our music director. So yeah, we've been collaborating just fine. We've been texting with each other, and she has a new baby, and it's all very exciting. With the English department, I think there's 12 of us. So, you know, that can get kind of difficult to pull everybody together. Not everybody is teaching the same grade level or has the same experience. And a lot of us, well, a lot of them are taking this summer break thing seriously, which is everybody's God-given right. So are not available 24 hours a day. So it's hard to just kind of connect with each other sometimes.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I'm running dry on questions here. Anyone else have a question that we haven't addressed yet? Or any of the teachers that have since come on have something about their input that they wished they could have shared earlier when we were going down my list of questions with Patrick?
Were you going to share something, Patrick? You look like, okay.
No.
I guess like the one other thing that I wanted to mention is also, so I'm a teacher. I'm also an instructional coach at Ellen. So I also work with the elementary C&I department. And we've been thinking as a department a lot, even though we're on vacation, about how to support our teachers when we come back in the fall. And so we have already been, I actually just videotaped 2 professional developments today that we'll be sharing with teachers, with the classroom teachers. So there is also a lot of work going on behind the scenes. And there will be too, once we have a better picture of what next year looks like, to help make sure that our teachers are being supported as much as we can. But we're not a very large department. There's not even one of us per school. So there is a limitation on staff time, but we're doing our best to get out the support that we can for our teachers.
Thank you. Does that mean you're having to work all summer long though?
Yeah, but have you met me? I'm always working anyways. And actually most teachers, I think actually, Kristen, that's a really good point. Most teachers work in the summer. Like the reason that we're putting out PDs, I don't know when they're going out, if they're going out next week or later this week, is because we've heard from teachers that they want to get a head start on the next year. So we're working so that they can get their head start as soon as they can.
That's lovely. I feel bad because it's been a tough spring that they should probably recharge their batteries from, but that's lovely that they're looking ahead and wanting to be ready for whatever we face in the future here with school. Are there some things in this process that you see as a silver lining, some changes that you're so grateful for and are hoping that get kept forevermore?
I'm sorry.
I'm sure there are, and I'll let my colleagues answer in a second. I'm sure there are. Right now, many of them though are tinged with the patina of this chaos, and so it is hard for me to see through that for the things that are underneath. I'll share a story that one of my colleagues at Pioneer High School actually shared in public comment at a school board meeting. She's an art teacher, and she said, you know, I as an art teacher never would have deployed Google Classroom in my classroom. Like that didn't seem to be, like she does drawing and painting. I never would have thought about that. And she said, and I never would have before this started ever thought about the process of how can I have students continue to make art at home when all of the traditional art supplies, the traditional media are all locked up in my classroom. She said, I and my students were forced to be incredibly creative, and as a result, like they did some of the best work they've done all year. Because they were forced to do this under you know less than ideal circumstances, and that forces human beings to be creative. And so I imagine that there are lots of similar stories of people who were forced to be creative, and as a result came up with an incredible solution to a problem that they will keep. I really just want a weekend though, so or a short vacation. So it's hard for me to see through the rest of it. But I know that there are stories like that out there.
Yeah, I was telling my administrator that I, in many cases, feel I'm doing some of the best teaching of my life, or I was before school ended, because I have time to really slow down and work with, you know, individual kids. The kids who needed it the most were not able to come in early or stay late. And so to have a 30-minute tutorial where I'm trying to help them one-on-one and any other kid who has come for more help, it wasn't meeting their needs. I was able to do, I had one student, I did a 2.5-hour Zoom call with him, with sharing my screen and pointing out, I had his work up from Google Classroom and saying, okay, maybe you want to rethink this, and why don't we go to the internet and see what resource we can find, all stuff that I couldn't have done in my classroom. So, and then with drama, we figured out how to put on a play. And that was pretty remarkable.
There's some great stories. What did you do as your production online?
Ours was called 10 Ways to Survive Life in a Quarantine by Don Salinas. And it was actually really, really cute. The kids were able to just do a video of their monologue, their, you know, their character's advice or story. And then one of my advanced drama students edited most of it together before he ran into the technological limitations of editing off of his cell phone. So I did a few of it, and the kids I gave it to them on Friday of last week, maybe. And so they just had permission today to share that out with whoever they wanted to.
Oh, that's great. Are you asking the school site to maybe put a link to it?
Not yet. I want to see how their families feel about it. And, you know, it's great, but it was also thrown up in like 2 weeks. So.
Right. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, I listened into the State Assembly's Education Committee meeting early last week, and a lot of art teachers and theater art teachers came in and talked about how they wanted to be assured that the funding would be there for the programs to continue and the significance of the program. So I just thought you'd like to hear that.
Thank you. I do appreciate that.
Several teachers called into that. Well, I really appreciate that everyone came in on an evening, especially after a long day work. I'm sorry, Patrick, that you're working long days, but I appreciate your having the bandwidth to join in tonight and help and better inform some members of the community that were able to dial in as well tonight. And I'll get this posted to YouTube so those that weren't free to dial in tonight can have the information as well. But thank you all for joining, and I look forward to more conversations. Next week, I'll be focusing in on the education to prison pipeline, bringing in some of our community leaders to talk about that, and how with everything pivoting into change with education, maybe it's an opportunity to make some more changes to tighten that pipeline and slow things down a little more. So hopefully you'll be able to join me again next week. No, not next week, 2 weeks from now. So that'll be July 6th. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.